this is Neil Woods to speak. And Neil, I want you to introduce yourself and then go on with your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Morgana, for inviting me to speak here today amongst this very esteemed panel. I'm a former undercover police officer, so I used to catch drug dealers for a living. So I very much come from the system, this international connected prohibition. But I'm also part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. I'm a board member in the United States and also here in Europe. Now, opponents of decriminalisation will often say that the answer does not lie in a more liberal approach, but it lies in more policing, tougher measures, more prison sentences. And there are still some police who will say this. And unfortunately, as we've just heard in Norway, some of the police voices talk in those terms. But as part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, I am referring to the experiences of police all over the world, because my experiences are shared by police I speak to on an almost daily basis around the world, across many, many nations. But if you'll forgive me, I'll refer to a personal experience, because I think a personal narrative often makes things very clear for an audience. As I say, I used to work undercover. So I used to infiltrate drug dealing gangs in inner cities across the United Kingdom. So I would spend around 6 or 7 months infiltrating some of the most violent and dangerous drug dealing gangs in the country. And in order to do this, I would embed myself in some of the more vulnerable people in our communities. And in fact, I would purposefully pick on the very vulnerable, the most vulnerable people in the communities. Well, because they're the easiest to manipulate, and I could get them to do what I wanted them to do. And often the more vulnerable people, the more problematic drug users, they had the best contacts with the gangsters and the best contacts so that I could get introduced to people further up the chain. Now, if this sounds rather ruthless, this casual manipulation of vulnerable people, well, if you support a punitive drug policy, you have to accept that this ruthless approach is part of the entire system. And in fact, isn't that the basis of a punitive drug policy? That we are harming people, further traumatizing them, sending them to prison for some sense of a greater good, in the way that supposedly we will reduce the greater problems to society by doing so. Well, one such vulnerable person in Nottingham, I befriended him. I became his best friend. I spent time listening to him. I understood his childhood trauma because I paid attention and listened to him. I was perhaps the first person that had ever listened to him. But it wasn't to help him, it was to manipulate him. And at the end of that 7-month operation, he attempted suicide, because from his point of view, it was the final straw. It was the instance that made him feel worthless, because he'd managed to find one friend in this world, one person he could talk to, and it was a lie. It was a deception. But I carried on doing what I was doing, because to me, as a police officer, I was very, very driven in catching those gangsters at the end of the operation. To me, the end justified the means. For one operation, which I'm going to tell you about, it was in the town of Northampton, and a very, very infamous gang called the Burger Bar Boys, a rather cute name for a vicious organisation. They were using extreme sexual violence as part of their reputation building, as part of their intimidation, as part of their competition with other gangs. It took me weeks and weeks to infiltrate this gang and to meet the leaders. But eventually I did. I almost got killed twice in that process. On one occasion, the gang stripped me at gunpoint, believing I was wearing a wire, believing I was a member of the drug squad. So I was very aware of how close to being murdered I was, but I still kept going because I thought that the end justified the risk. And after 7 months of work, I had managed to gather evidence of conspiracy against the main 6 gangsters. And extremely vicious they were. They were implicated in multiple murders, including some very high-profile machine gunning in Birmingham. And at the end of that 7 months operation, I was completely sure that I had caught every single person involved in their operation. I was sure that I'd caught every single person who was supplying the heroin and crack cocaine, and everyone who was delivering it, all of the sex workers who were part of the network, every single person. And in fact, I'd gathered evidence against 96 people, 6 of the main gangsters, but plus 90 of their support network. So I thought, this is going to have an incredible impact. Finally, we are going to be able to shut down an entire market. There were police from 5 different police forces, hundreds of different individuals brought in to carry out this operation. So many doors were smashed in, so many houses searched, so many people were arrested. And then after the dust had settled, I spoke to the intelligence officer who was tasked with keeping his ear to the ground to keep informed of the impact. And he said to me, yes, we have managed to interrupt the drug supply in Northampton for 2 hours. 2 hours. 7 months of work, almost getting myself killed, 96 people arrested, hundreds of officers, an enormous amount of money invested in that operation to interrupt the drug supply for 2 hours. Now, as I've said, I represent police, both serving and retired, all across the world. And my experience is replicated at every single level of the drug supply chain, every single level, from the street to the regional to the international cartel level. Wherever police have a success like that, what they do is they create an opportunity for someone else to fill that gap. Now, I don't know for certain that it was the Burger Bar Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, that took up that opportunity that I had created for them. But you can imagine the scene. The rival gang hears the news and they're smiling and celebrating. They say, put the call in, order extra supplies. We are going to make a fortune. Look what the police have done for us. And this is the reality of the current system. But the problem is, this narrative does not generally find its way into academic circles or the political debate around drug policy. And yet, this is something that police understand in every nation around the world. The only difference you will have from nation to nation is the degree of honesty from which you will hear from the police about the reality. Policing drugs in a punitive environment, in a punitive policy regime, does not reduce crime. There is no evidence that it ever reduces crime. Arresting people in large numbers, filling up the prisons and seizing large numbers of drugs is not evidence of reducing crime. It is evidence of police activity. And more often than not, police activity in this area increases crime. And to varying degrees of honesty, you will see this. Police can tell you this from any nation because it's in their own databases, their own criminal intelligence databases in every nation on earth. Where there is a gap in the market, more often than not, that gap is fought over, often with violence. And where it is not fought over with violence, it is fought over by price drops, 2-for-1 deals. So very often, consumption on a localized basis goes up. Now, of course, what I'm telling you raises questions about who should be in control of the drug markets. And I very much echo and support what Michelle said earlier on at the start of this conference, that it, in my view and in my organisation's view, It should be the state controlling these substances and not organised crime. But we are a very long way away from that. What we're talking about today is decriminalisation. But decriminalisation can also reduce crime. It can reduce crime where policing never does. What each regime has in common where they have decriminalised drug possession is that they have managed to reduce the levels of problematic use. And this is the important number. The important number is not how many people are using drugs, but how many people are using drugs problematically. Now, if we use only the example of heroin, using statistics from Switzerland or the United Kingdom, the most problematic 10% of heroin consumers consume 50% of the market value of that drug. So if you only take care of that most problematic 10%, you're reducing the market. You're reducing the value of money which goes into the pockets of organised crime. This can reduce crime like policing can't, because the police are really good at catching drug dealers. If you give them twice the resources, they will catch twice as many. But it doesn't reduce the size of the market. Only a health-based approach can do that. So the best way of fighting organised crime is a health intervention. In Switzerland, where they prescribe heroin, they have had dramatic reductions in crime. Any health-based approach which reduces the consumption of problematic consumers is less money in the pockets of organised crime. But these health-based approaches are not so possible in a punitive environment. Now, often people will respond to my arguments from the opposing view by saying, well, in that case, that means we're just not putting people in prison for long enough. Because if we put drug users in prison longer, then they won't be using as many drugs and the money won't be going to organised crime. Well, let me shatter that illusion, because in prison, drugs are, in most countries, at least twice as expensive than they are on the outside. In the United Kingdom, they are 4 times more expensive. And there is a very complex system of credit rating to decide how much credit somebody will be given in prison. And that credit rating very much depends on who can be exploited outside. So if you put someone in prison who has problematic drug use and they have family members on the outside, if they have a sister, a wife, a mother, those people will be exploited. If they have children, those children will be exploited. So by longer prison sentences mean bigger debts, mean bigger crime, or more crime that person will commit when they come out of prison. And for any politician who believes that they can achieve a drug-free prison, well, let me tell you, there is not a drug-free prison anywhere in the world. And the harder you try, the more the corruption increases, because the more money organised crime has to invest in corruption to beat the measures you try and put into place. And that just increases the cost of the drugs in the prison. The truth is, our current drug policy is a catastrophe. It's a crisis of organised crime. It's a crisis of corruption. And all of the speakers so far today have quite rightly spoken in terms of saving lives and reducing harm. And of course, that should be the measure of a successful drug policy. But I'm trying to appeal now from a policing point of view that this is also about beating organised crime. This is also about reducing the impact of crime in our communities, because drugs policing does not do that and can never do that. And my organisation is always at your disposal to help convince your populations that policing is not the answer. So thank you very much for listening to me today.